There is something you did, or several things, accumulated across the years, that you have quietly decided defines you. Not officially, you would not say it out loud this way, but underneath the functioning life, there is a verdict, a story about who you are that was written by your worst chapter and that you have been living inside ever since, even as the surface life moved on. The mistake, the failure, the specific moment of having been someone you did not want to be, it has become, in the architecture of your self-understanding, load-bearing. Remove it, and you are not sure what would still be standing. Augustine of Hippo, the 4th and 5th century North African bishop whose Confessions is the first true autobiography in Western literature, the first sustained attempt by any writer to examine the interior life of a single human being in unflinching detail, spent the first 31 years of his life accumulating exactly this kind of verdict against himself. He stole. He lied. He pursued pleasure with a hunger he could not satisfy and could not stop pursuing. He fathered a child outside of marriage and could not commit to the mother. He spent 9 years in a religious movement he later considered a serious philosophical error. By his own unsparing account, he was, for the first 3 decades of his life, exactly the kind of person his later self would have warned others against becoming. And then he wrote the most influential spiritual autobiography in the history of the Western world, not to hide the record, but to put it on the page in more detail and with more honesty than anyone had ever dared. Because his central discovery, the one that took him 3 decades and a near total collapse to arrive at, was this: the self that did those things is not the self that is doing the telling. You are not the sum of your worst chapter. You are the thing capable of turning the page. There is a specific kind of self-imprisonment that operates beneath the level of conscious belief. Not the person who is in denial about their past, that is a different problem. The person who has fully acknowledged what they did, who carries no illusions about it, and who has, in the acknowledging, made a quiet category error, treating the action as identical with the actor, confusing what they did with what they are. The mistake becomes not an event in a life, but a permanent feature of the architecture, the thing that explains, retroactively, everything that came after. I am the kind of person who did that. Not, I did that, and I am also the kind of person capable of becoming someone who would not. This produces a specific paralysis. The person who has fused with their worst action cannot fully trust their own growth, because growth implies that the earlier self was provisional, and the fused identity needs the earlier self to be permanent in order for the self-condemnation to feel honest rather than self-serving. So the person stays tethered to the verdict, punishes themselves with it quietly for years, long after anyone else has stopped keeping score. Treats their own continued guilt as a form of integrity when it has become, in fact, a refusal of the very change that integrity would require. Augustine diagnosed this with a precision that has not been improved upon in 16 centuries. He called it, in the language of his tradition, bondage of the will, the specific condition of a person who wants to change and finds that wanting is not the same as being, because the old self has accumulated enough weight, enough habit, enough identity investment that it resists the very transformation the person is asking for. I was held back, he writes, not by an iron imposed by anyone else, but by the iron of my own will. The chain was forged by myself. This is the bondage, and it is also, in the architecture of the Confessions, the precise condition that gets dissolved, not by effort, not by sufficient willpower applied for long enough, but by a recognition that arrives almost like a rescue, that the self capable of examining the chain is not the self that forged it. Aurelius Augustinus was born in 354 AD in Tagaste, a provincial town in Roman North Africa, in what is now Algeria. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian whose prayers and tears for her son's soul run through the Confessions as a steady undercurrent.
His father was a pagan who converted late in life. Augustine was gifted, recognized early as exceptionally intelligent, and was sent for an education in rhetoric that would have, in the ordinary course of things, become a successful provincial professional, a lawyer, an administrator, a teacher of the elite. Instead, his 20s became the long, restless search that the Confessions documents with such unsparing detail. He took a mistress in Carthage and lived with her for over a decade, fathering a son, Aeodidatus, whom he loved deeply and whose early death he would later mourn in the book's pages. He joined the Manichees, a dualistic religious movement that explained evil as a separate cosmic force at war with good, which Augustine found intellectually satisfying because it let him locate the source of his own bad behavior outside himself. He pursued a career in rhetoric, teaching in Carthage, then Rome, then Milan, chasing the professional advancement that he simultaneously suspected was hollow.
It was in Milan, in his early 30s, listening to the sermons of Bishop Ambrose and reading the Platonist philosophers, that the old framework began to genuinely crack. He describes in Book 8 of the Confessions the famous scene in the garden, the internal war between the self that wanted to change and the self that did not yet want it badly enough. The famous prayer, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet." The collapse into tears under a fig tree, and the child's voice from over the wall, repeating, "Tolle, lege," take up and read. He opened a text of Paul's letters at random. The verse he landed on addressed exactly the dissolute habits he had spent years failing to break. He describes the moment not as willpower finally succeeding, but as something closer to a sudden, total reordering, light flooding in, and all the darkness of doubt vanished away. He was baptized in 387 at 32. He returned to North Africa, was ordained a priest somewhat against his will in 391, became Bishop of Hippo in 395, and spent the next 35 years as one of the most important theological and philosophical minds in the history of the Western Church, writing The City of God, voluminous letters, sermons, and, around 997 to 400, the Confessions itself. Not a memoir written for vanity, but a sustained act of public self-examination addressed in form directly to God and intended to demonstrate that no life is so compromised that it cannot be genuinely, completely reordered. He died in 430 as the Vandals besieged Hippo, the Roman world he had known disintegrating around him. He had spent the second half of his life building something that the first half of his life would not have predicted was possible. The philosophy of the Confessions. Two ideas in particular, examined carefully, dismantled the fusion between the self and its worst chapter. The first is the distinction between memory and identity. Augustine is, as far as we know, the first writer in the Western tradition to treat memory itself as a subject of sustained philosophical inquiry, devoting an entire book of the Confessions, Book 10, to the nature of memory and what it means that the self can hold its own past without being trapped inside it. He observes something simple and radical. The self that remembers the theft of the pears in his youth, a famous episode in which he and some friends stole fruit they did not even want, purely for the thrill of the transgression, is not the boy who stole them. The remembering self has the event available to examine, to learn from, to be honest about. But the remembering self is doing something the remembered boy could not do. Holding the action at a reflective distance, evaluating it, refusing to simply repeat it. The capacity to remember an action without being compelled to reenact it is, for Augustine, direct evidence that the self is not identical with its history. It is something that has a history, and having a history is different from being one. This sounds almost too simple stated directly, but its implications are not simple.
It means the project of self-condemnation, holding yourself permanently liable for who you once were, as though the verdict must remain open forever to be taken seriously, is, in Augustine's analysis, a misunderstanding of what memory is for. Memory exists so the self can learn and change. A self that uses memory only to reconfirm an old verdict has turned a tool for growth into an instrument of permanent imprisonment. The second idea is grace, and it is the more theologically specific, but also, stripped of its doctrinal packaging, the more practically urgent claim. Augustine's mature theology insists that genuine transformation cannot be produced by the unaided will alone, that the person trying to change purely through more effort, more willpower, more self-discipline applied against an old pattern will frequently find what he found in his own 20s, the wanting to change and the inability to change coexisting indefinitely, the will divided against itself. What broke the deadlock for Augustine was not more effort. It was the experience of being met by something outside the self's own resources that allowed the old self to be relinquished rather than merely suppressed. You do not have to accept Augustine's theology to take the structural claim seriously, that the self stuck in a permanent loop of self-judgment is often stuck precisely because it is trying to escape the loop using the same resources that built it, and that what is actually required is something more like reception than effort, the willingness to be addressed by something larger than the self-condemning voice, and to let that address, rather than another round of willpower, do the work of releasing the old identity's grip.
Now the bridge. Because Augustine was a 4th century North African bishop writing within a specifically Christian theological framework, addressing God directly across all 13 books of the Confessions, and most people watching this video are not working within that framework. But here is what translates without requiring any of the theology. The mistake you have fused with your identity, the chapter you have allowed to become load-bearing, the quiet, permanent court of self-judgment you have been sitting in for years, mistaking the sitting for integrity rather than recognizing it as a refusal to actually change. Augustine's first move, the distinction between memory and identity, is available to anyone. You can remember what you did with complete honesty, without flinching, without softening it, and still recognize that the remembering self is not the same self that acted. The capacity to examine the action at all, the discomfort you feel about it, the desire to be someone who would not do it again, these are not symptoms of a self still trapped in its old pattern. They are evidence of a self that has already, in some essential way, moved past it. His second move, that transformation often requires something more like reception than willpower, is also available outside any specific theology. Whatever has actually worked for you in the past, when change finally came, was it usually the 20th iteration of pure grinding effort, or was there, more often, a moment when something shifted that did not feel entirely self-generated? A conversation, a piece of writing, a relationship, an unexpected mercy extended by someone you did not expect it from, something that met you and made the old identity easier to set down rather than harder to hold on to. Here is what Augustine asks of you practically, today. First, separate the memory from the verdict. Take the one thing you have been carrying as a permanent indictment, the mistake, the failure, the chapter you would not want printed. Write down plainly what happened, no softening. Then write separately what the self that is doing the writing actually thinks about it now. Notice the gap between the two. That gap, the distance between the self that acted and the self capable of this honest accounting, is not a loophole or a rationalization. It is the literal, demonstrable evidence that you are not the same person in the way that matters as the one who did the thing. Second, identify where self-judgment has replaced actual change. Augustine's bondage of the will is precisely this. Years of feeling bad about a pattern substituting for the work of actually interrupting it. Ask honestly, Is the guilt you are carrying currently producing different behavior, or has it become a kind of stationary emotional tax you pay instead of changing? If it is the latter, the guilt has stopped being moral seriousness and become a way of avoiding the harder, less comfortable work of genuine revision.
Third, practice receiving rather than only striving. Find one place where you have been relying purely on willpower to produce a change that willpower alone has not produced. And instead of applying more of the same pressure, try the Augustinian alternative. Open yourself to being met. A conversation you have been avoiding because it might offer you more grace than you think you deserve. A community, a practice, a piece of writing that has helped others in your position. Not as another task to grind through, but as something you allow to address you, rather than something you control. Fourth, write your own Book 10. Spend 20 minutes with your own memory, examined honestly, the way Augustine examined his. Not to relitigate the verdict, to notice what the examining itself proves, that there is a self here capable of looking directly at the worst material without being destroyed by it or controlled by it. That capacity, sustained, honest self-examination that does not collapse into either denial or permanent self-condemnation, is, in Augustine's own life, the precise turning point between bondage and freedom. I want to close with the fig tree. Milan, a garden, late in his 31st year. Augustine on the ground, weeping, the argument with himself that had been running for over a decade, finally reaching the point where words gave out. Then the child's voice from beyond the wall, "Take up and read," and the book opened to the exact verse his entire dissolute decade needed to hear. He does not describe what followed as a triumph of willpower. He describes it as a flood of light, the darkness simply gone, as though something had finally been allowed to do what years of self-discipline could not. He got up from that ground a different person, not because the facts of his past had changed, not because the son he had fathered outside marriage was erased from the record, not because the decade with the Manichees could be struck from the account. All of it remained true. He wrote all of it down, in more detail than anyone before him had ever dared to do, and gave the book to the world. What changed was the relationship between the man and the record. The fact stayed. The verdict did not survive the garden. You are carrying your own version of the decade in Carthage. The question Augustine's whole book is built to ask is not whether the facts are true. They probably are. The question is whether you are still treating yourself as though the verdict that those facts seem to demand is the last word on who you are, or whether you are willing to get up off the ground and discover that the self capable of examining the record this honestly was never, in fact, identical to the self the record describes.
Here is the question Augustine leaves us with today. Not from the cathedral at Hippo, not from the 35 years of bishopric, or the city of God, or the theological architecture that would shape Western Christianity for 1,000 years afterward. From the garden, from the ground, from the moment before the book opened. What is the chapter you have fused with your identity? What is the verdict you have been sitting in, mistaking the sitting for honesty, rather than recognizing it as a refusal of the very change you say you want? And what would it mean not to forget what happened, not to soften it, but to notice that the self doing the remembering is not the self being remembered? Leave that in the comments, because naming the gap between the two is the beginning of what Augustine spent the rest of his life building. Not the erasure of the past, the freedom to no longer be ruled by it. I'll see you in the next one.